In today's episode, we'll break down two important stories. First, we'll talk about the risks to the oil of the Middle East, and then we'll talk about small models, big economics. Welcome back to the Daily Brief by Zerodha, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what's actually happening in the most important stories from business and markets. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Wednesday, 4th March. Coming to the first story. If you're anything like us, you've probably spent the last few days hitting refresh continuously across the news, Twitter, and Reddit, trying to understand what the hell is going on in the Middle East. We have no idea how an event like this plays out and how it could touch us here in India, and we don't know what to anticipate. There are various possibilities, big and small, that are worth considering, from what happens to the Middle East as an aviation hub, to whether trade routes between India and the West choke again, to whether our exports to the Middle East get compromised, to what an incident like this means to our foreign exchange reserves, and so on. The most obvious, though, is that oil could suddenly become expensive, and that's already visible in the charts. Prices, though, are an abstraction. They condense into a single number what the market feels about the overall level of risk that the world's oil supply is under. That neat picture flattens a mess of physical realities, where individual oil fields, ports, ships, and more all face different threats if the war escalates. So, to really sense what the risks are, it's helpful to understand where the Middle East's oil infrastructure actually sits. Only then can you understand the specific places where things can go seriously wrong. Now, a word of caution. We are covering this on a Monday, and by the time you come across this, the whole landscape could look very different. The war could escalate, they could reach some sort of ceasefire, some of the infrastructure we mentioned could already be taken out, more countries could be pulled in, and so on. Forgive us for anything that slips us by. Let's begin by looking at the Middle East. At its heart, it's the Arabian Peninsula. And this massive arid landmass is particularly interesting because of its edges. These edges shape everything about how the region's oil reaches the world. Now, to the peninsula's east is the Persian Gulf, which is a long, narrow channel which is almost pinched shut before it opens through the Strait of Hormuz into the Arabian Sea. On the other side of this channel is Iran, and to the west, the Red Sea marks an even longer corridor between the peninsula and Africa. Its southern tip tapers down into a tiny opening, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, before opening into the Indian Ocean. We'll come back to this repeatedly. Now, this part of the world holds nearly half of the world's proven oil reserves, but those aren't spread all across the Middle East. Instead, they're clumped together in a thin band around the Persian Gulf, the eastern channel we spoke about. They either lie inside Iran or across a narrow sea from it. And this region now is the epicenter of this conflict. Now, the biggest of the region's oil producers, the load-bearing pillar of the Gulf oil system, is Saudi Arabia. There are over 250 billion barrels of oil under its sands, and the kingdom pulls out 9 to 10 million of them a day. It also has a lot of spare capacity, so if it's ever necessary or profitable to do so, it can add another 3 million barrels every day to its output. Most of that oil, however, comes from a thin strip at the eastern edge of the country. Nearly a third of that output comes just from Ghawar, the world's largest conventional oil field. Other fields too lie in the vicinity, and they're all within 300 kilometers of Iran, well within the range of its missiles. Much of that oil is funneled into a single node, the Akbeg processing facility, where sulfur impurities are stripped out of the region's sour crude to make it sweet. And nearly 7% of the world's oil passes through this single facility every day. That also makes it a target for drone attacks, as the kingdom learnt in 2019. The region's other oil producers are all concentrated nearby, and the second largest oil producer in the Middle East is Iraq, which pushes out around 4.5 million barrels every day. Most of its oil fields sit at its southern tip at Basra, which opens through a narrow corridor into the Persian Gulf. Just below, to the west of the Gulf, is Kuwait, which produces approximately 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. And lower down along the edge of the Gulf is Qatar, which produces a relatively modest 600,000 barrels a day, along with 1.3 million barrels of natural gas. Below that is the United Arab Emirates with an output of just under 3 million barrels a day. On the other side of the conflict, Iran's oil-bearing regions too line the same Gulf. Most of its oil reserves sit at the very north of the Gulf in its Khuzestan province. While it's been under severe sanctions for decades, the country manages to export a substantial amount of oil itself through an extensive shadow economy. Realistically, there's only one major oil producer that sits outside this Gulf: Oman. But right now, Oman produces less than 1 million barrels of oil per day, making it a rather minor player compared to its peers. This all boils down to one fact: a stupendous amount of the region's oil infrastructure, and frankly, that of the entire world, borders a single sea. And all along the Persian Gulf's roughly 5,000-kilometer coastline is a stupendous network of oil wells, refineries, terminals, and more. Almost all of Middle East's oil exports begin their journey in this Gulf. That, as we'll soon discover, is incredibly important. Now, the region's smaller countries have almost no way of bypassing the Gulf. All the oil from Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar exclusively goes through the Persian Gulf. In theory, Iran has a way of getting around the Persian Gulf through pipelines that cross the entire region and open into Jask, right below. But that port is practically out of commission. Most Iranian oil, over 90%, is exported out of the island of Karg in the Persian Gulf. There are, in fact, only two ways to bypass the Gulf. The first is Saudi Arabia's East Well Oil Pipeline, or the Petro Line. This cuts right across the Arabian desert, running for over 1,200 kilometers. It begins at Abqaiq. At the eastern end, it reaches the Ras Tanura or Juaima export complex into the Persian Gulf. The other end, however, runs all the way to Yanbu at the west by the Red Sea. On a good day, these pipes carry 5 million barrels of oil. But ever since Houthi attacks have put the Red Sea in danger, the line has been at 80 to 90% capacity. Effectively, if the Gulf no longer is an option, these pipes can at most carry 1 million barrels a day. The UAE too has a pipeline of its own, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, and this carries oil from its onshore oil fields to just below where the Persian Gulf ends at Fujairah. Only this pipeline too is running at over 70% capacity. In a pinch, that just leaves 500,000 barrels of daily capacity. When they say that a war in the Middle East could hurt oil markets, here's what they actually mean. There are a series of choke points strewn across the region which are critical to the world's oil supply, and at the moment, all of those choke points are in play. The most consequential of these is at the edge of the Persian Gulf, where the Arabian Peninsula juts out like a horn towards Iran. This is the Strait of Hormuz. At this point, which stretches for 3 kilometers, the waterway suddenly narrows. Its width, from over 200 kilometers at its widest point, drops to just 33 kilometers. All of the Persian Gulf's oil, more than 20 million barrels per day, or roughly 20% of the world's supply and 1/4 of the oil carried through the seas, passes through this one choke point. That's over $500 billion worth of energy products a year. Cut this off, and you can break the back of the world's oil trade. Iran's position here is incredibly strong. It's built a range of defenses: naval mines, anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, drones, and more. Should it ever decide so, the country can choke the strait in a few hours. But Iran doesn't need to choke the spot. It simply needs to create a credible threat that it will, and the commercial logic of crossing this point collapses. At the time we write this, that already seems to be underway, and over the last 2 days, 3 commercial ships came under attack. Since then, many commercial operators have suspended all operations through the strait. Over 150 tankers are stranded inside. Meanwhile, insurers have essentially refused to give war insurance to any ship plying the route. That effectively kills any scope for commercial shipping in the region. Now, there are a few alternatives. In theory, Saudi Arabia can push oil out of Yanbu at its western coast and into the Red Sea. But separating the Red Sea from the Arabian Sea is another such choke point, the Bab el Mandeb. This point has already been under pressure for a few years from Houthi rebels that are allied with Iran. And that just leaves the UAE's pipelines out of Fujairah. But those have limited capacity. Meanwhile, there are other pressure points, even if they aren't this absolute. Almost all of the region's oil production and infrastructure is within the reach of both sides' missiles. All of it is at risk. And there are places where that risk concentrates. For instance, oil from several fields in a region can funnel into a single refinery which processes lakhs of barrels a day. If an attack forces that capacity offline, the entire supply chain can drag to a halt, even if there's oil to move at the wellhead. Recently, for instance, Iranian drones attacked Saudi Arabia's biggest oil refinery at Ras Tanura. The city also contains its biggest oil terminal. The refinery has now been shut. Every step of the supply chain presents something similar. For instance, the Saudi facility at Abqaiq, which sweetens 7 million barrels of crude oil a day, may well be the single most critical point in the world's oil infrastructure. If the facility is damaged, the world could use a few percentage points of oil capacity for months. This is a delicate moment for the world's oil markets. There's a very real risk that 1/5 of the world's oil supply could disappear if the conflict carries on for long. If the conflict lasts for a short while, the world's reserves can shrug this moment off. If it carries on, however, you might see prices rise slowly. Now, this comes at a time when oil facilities as a whole are turning into targets. Only recently, for instance, Ukrainian drones attacked a major Russian oil terminal. At moments like this, while the damage might be limited to the country that was attacked, the costs carry over to the rest of the world. That's particularly bad news for a country like India, which imports most of its oil. We are currently scrambling for options. Shortly after our attempt to pivot away from Russian oil, for instance, we might embrace it again. This story is changing rapidly, and there's nothing we can say for certain. But good news, like oil, might soon be in short supply. For all the sources mentioned in this video, don't forget to check out our newsletter. The link is in the description. Coming to the second story. The next time you ask your phone's AI assistant to draft a quick reply, consider what's actually happening under the hood. Your words travel to a data center, possibly on another continent. There, a model the size of a small library processes them, generates a two-line response, and sends it back. Everything happens in a couple of seconds using a small slice of a very expensive GPU. All for something like, sounds good, let's do Thursday. There's a growing school of thought that considers this absurd, not because the technology doesn't work, but because it's a bad architecture for the job. Calling on frontier AI models, the ones that can get AIR4 in India's toughest exams, to summarize your emails is like using a rocket to kill an ant. Sure, it works, but it's overkill. What if the model that drafted that reply lived on your phone? It would be smaller, faster, and private. And after the initial setup, it would essentially run for free. That's the promise of small language models or SLMs. And the debate between SLMs and their giant cousins, large language models or LLMs, is becoming a consequential economic question in tech. But to understand why, you need to understand how these models actually work and where the money goes. For that, you need to get comfortable with three ideas: parameters, inference, and tokens. So, a language model like ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, Anthropic's Claude is at its core a machine that takes text in and spits text out. To do so, it uses a ridiculous number of adjustable dials, and each dial is a number or a parameter. Big models can have hundreds of billions of them. Now, what do these parameters do? They control how strongly the model leans toward one meaning over another. So think of it like this: every word has its own meaning, of course, but by itself, that meaning is ambiguous. It shifts based on the words around it. Models learn those shifts, and the patterns get stored across parameters. So imagine you ask ChatGPT something like, what should one do if the economy is overheating? It needs to realize that the word overheating has nothing to do with heat at all, or else it'll ask you to turn on the air conditioning instead of fighting inflation. There are infinite such examples in any language where you infer a word's meaning from what it's around, and it's nearly impossible to hard code rules for every single possibility. But a model recognizes that when economy and overheating come near each other, things like interest rates or inflation are around the corner. The model stores such things as mathematical relationships based on billions of examples of human text. Think of it as preparing a giant graph of how all words connect to each other, except that instead of just an x and a y axis, it has thousands of axes over thousands of dimensions. With such a huge, complex graph, it can map language out in many ways. It can understand what the same word does in different contexts, or how the sentence's tone changes it, or how polite it is, or the emotional effect it has, and so on. Models don't think in terms of words, though. They think in tokens. Now, a token is just a chunk of text, sometimes a whole word, sometimes part of one, sometimes something else entirely, like a space or a punctuation mark. The word India, for instance, might be a single token, but a word like unbreakable could be split into three, like un, break, and able. It's at this level that the model draws its relationships. Now, there are two phases in a model's life, and understanding them is essential to understanding AI economics. So, training is the learning phase. The model reads absurd amounts of text and plays one game on repeat. Given what I've learned so far, what token comes next? In the beginning, it guesses completely at random and gets it entirely wrong. But with every wrong guess, it nudges its parameters to be slightly less wrong the next time. Over trillions of attempts, the model gets educated. And training is brutally expensive. GPU chips running for weeks or months on end, but it's mostly a one time cost. After training, the model's parameters are locked. Then you turn to inference when you actually use the model. So, when you ask a question, the model isn't learning anything new, it's using what it already learned to generate an answer. Now, training costs a lot per run, but those runs happen occasionally. Inference is cheap per query, but happens every time someone uses your model. This defines the economics of each. Now imagine a model has 70 billion parameters. For that to be useful, the GPU must be able to call on them quickly. And so each parameter must sit in GPU memory at each step of inference. Usually, 70 billion parameters take up roughly 140 gigabytes. And a single high end GPU might have 40 to 80 GB. So the larger your model is, the more GPUs must work together to run it. So that means more hardware, more electricity, and more infrastructure. Meanwhile, a smaller model, say 3 billion parameters, could fit comfortably on a single GPU. Then the GPU must actually work through those parameters. It begins with the input you give it and then starts running its calculations, navigating through the web of relationships it's stored. The longer your prompt, the more work it has to do in pushing out an output. And every output token is the result of a massive number of mathematical operations using those parameters. The more the parameters, the more math calculation done per token. So inference cost grows along three axes: model size, which is how many parameters, input length, which is how many tokens you send, and output length, which is how many tokens the model generates back. Now we've met the LLMs, the giant models in data centers. But small language models sit at the other end, roughly 100 million to 5 billion parameters, though that boundary is a bit fuzzy and shifts over time. They can be so small, in fact, that they might not even need data centers at all. They could be compact enough to run on your phone, laptop, or local server. Think of Google's Gemini Nano built into Pixel phones, Apple's on device models, or Microsoft's Phi series. This comes with trade offs, of course. They're fast, cheap, and private, but they're less capable of complex, open ended tasks. And the smaller the model, the more you're sacrificing. If all else were the same, you might always choose more capability no matter how small your task is. But if you're a business that's deploying an AI model, you're asking more complex questions, like where the model runs and what that implies. You want to know what each query costs, how fast it comes, if it works when there's no internet, what happens when the model gets it wrong, and so on. GPUs drink electricity, and research on a 65 billion parameter model shows that every million output tokens of inference can use approximately 0.83 to 1.11 kilowatt hour. As AI services handle hundreds of millions of queries daily, those energy needs add up enough that they're turning into a serious macro problem in places like the United States. In 2024, data centers consumed about 415 terawatt hours of electricity, roughly 1.5% of global demand, and AI demand has only exploded since. When you run a small model on your phone or laptop, on the other hand, you no longer have to ship it to a data center and back. That means the energy needed per query drops sharply. Some research suggests on device inference can use up to approximately 95% less energy and cut carbon footprint by approximately 88% versus cloud GPUs. That directly lowers the cost of each query. Then there's security. If your prompt isn't being sent to a server halfway across the world, you're not relying on someone else's systems, policies, or legal jurisdiction to keep it safe. You keep more control by default. So far, we've talked about why you might prefer a small on device model instead of a large one. But even among SLMs, you might not always want to run the largest models. Imagine, for instance, that you were designing a mobile game with realistic characters that you could talk to. If they were powered by a small model, they could manage basic dialogue and could emote to a basic level. But when you talk to them for long enough, the edges would show. A larger model, in contrast, could come up with lots of dialogue, creating the impression that all characters lived rich inner lives. So, what's the better choice? The larger one? So, there's a constraint. A study benchmarking models on a Samsung Galaxy S24 measured time to first token or TTFT, which is how long the model takes to start responding. For an 8 billion parameter model on that phone, TTFT was roughly 261 seconds just to begin answering a simple question. That is, if you started speaking to a character, they would respond 4 minutes later. Smaller models in the 100 million to 500 million range, sub-second to single-digit seconds. The choice is obvious. If a model takes 4 minutes to even start, it can be part of anything interactive. So, latency in cases like this is a hard gate on whether the tool creates value at all. So, what model does a business use and when? You can think about it as a simple equation. Total cost equals inference cost plus integration cost plus expected loss plus governance cost. On the one hand, you want to lower your inference cost. Bigger models simply cost more. You also want to be mindful of integration costs. You need to make sure the model actually sits well within your workflows and doesn't eat up a lot of time and resources to work with. For instance, if you have a lot of use cases, a large model might be able to one shot all of them, whereas you might have to spend a lot of engineering time in customizing a small model for everything. On the other hand, if you want a dependable system that does one thing quickly and reliably, it might not be a good idea to depend on a large model that changes its behavior with every update. Then there's the expected loss. How often will the model be wrong and how bad is it when it's wrong? Would a human catch the error or will it slip by easily? If a model hallucinates a financial summary and that feeds into an investment decision, you could face serious losses, much larger ones than your token bill. Finally, there's a governance cost, which is the effort required to make the system safe enough to deploy. If you're self hosting a smaller model with narrower use cases, you can build in controls like audits or redundancies. They're generally easier to reason about and test. Larger, more complex models are harder to fully understand and control. So, with that lens, the trade offs become clearer. There's no single answer to what's the better choice. Everything boils down to how you operate, how many questions you need answered, how fast, what the stakes are, and so on. With all this, it boils down to a unit economics and risk management choice. SLMs win when the workload is high volume, speed sensitive, offline friendly, or privacy heavy. It helps you with predictable standard responses. Think millions of small queries where cost and latency matter more than brilliance. LLMs win when the task is open ended, messy, or novel, and capability actually translates into results. It also helps when you want to avoid dumb mistakes in edge cases, and that's when you pay the premium. But this isn't a binary choice. Often, the most sensible setup is a hybrid one. A small on device model can act as the front gate and it can figure out intent, run safety checks, strip away sensitive data, and answer the easy stuff locally. The genuinely hard cases, which need deep reasoning or long context, can then be escalated to a cloud LLM. Now, as things move on, we expect to see a lot of creativity in how different models will be brought together. Perhaps then, the models will feel instant and seamless, and yet could be as smart as the best tools you've seen so far. Now, coming to the tidbits. Gold loans now make up 6% of banks' retail portfolios, up from 3% a year ago, as soaring gold prices boosted demand. Overall, retail credit grew 14.9% in January, but credit card growth slowed sharply to 1.5%. MSME lending remained strong, helping lift overall bank credit growth to 14.6%. Coming to the next tidbit. Amazon will stop charging seller referral fees on products priced below Rs 1,000 from March 16th. The move expands last year's zero fee policy and now covers over 125 million products. It aims to attract more small sellers as competition intensifies from Flipkart, Reliance, and quick commerce players. Coming to the final tidbit. Shaktikanta Das said Indian companies are financially stronger after years of deleveraging with cleaner balance sheets and better profitability. He noted early signs of a revival in private investment. Stronger trade ties and digital transformation are expected to support the next phase of growth. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.